They told him Canada would fold in 72 hours. They were wrong. And what happened next is the reason trade ministries from Brussels to Tokyo are still studying that single morning. If you follow geopolitics or global economics, you need to hear every second of what comes next, because the real story has barely been told. At 9:02 in the morning, Donald Trump signed an executive order his own advisors described internally as a submission mechanism. The language they used in White House briefings was not subtle. They expected Ottawa to break. The order placed a blanket 35% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, a 52% surcharge on Canadian steel and aluminum, a full suspension of the joint energy framework that had governed cross-border electricity and petroleum flows for 11 years, and buried in Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the supplementary text, a demand that Canada renegotiate its entire dairy and softwood lumber protection system within 90 days, or face a second wave of escalating tariffs. The Secretary of Commerce gave 3 separate television interviews before 10 in the morning. In each one, he described the order as a correction Canada would eventually accept as reasonable. In 2 of those interviews, he was asked if Ottawa had received advance warning. His answer, delivered with practiced calm, was yes, that Canada's trade representatives had been notified through proper channels. That answer was technically true. Canada had been told something was coming. What the Secretary did not say, possibly because he genuinely did not know, was what Canada had done with that information across the preceding 18 months. Stay with this, because the detail that comes next changes the entire shape of what you think you're watching. 18 months before Trump signed that order, Canadian intelligence and trade analysts completed a classified assessment. The document has no official existence on any public record, but 3 separate sources familiar with its contents have confirmed it was real. Internally, it was called Scenario Delta. It modeled exactly this situation: a blanket American tariff above 30%, a simultaneous energy framework suspension, and a demand for dairy and lumber renegotiation. It did not model these as possibilities. It modeled them as a scheduled event, and it laid out in precise operational detail a response structure designed to generate maximum economic counterpressure on the United States within a 4-hour window from the moment any such order was signed. The 4-hour target was not arbitrary. Canadian analysts had calculated, using American market hours, media cycle rhythms, and international financial messaging windows, that a reply delivered within 4 hours of an American trade move would land before U.S. markets had fully absorbed the initial order, before the White House communications team had finished shaping its narrative, and before allied governments had issued their first public comments. A reply inside 4 hours would not look reactive. It would appear and be reported as simultaneous, as if Canada had not answered America's action, but had acted at the very same moment, as equals on the same morning, rather than as a smaller country scrambling to respond to a superpower's choice. If you want to understand how a country of 40 million goes toe-to-toe with a country of 330 million and does not lose, what comes next is the answer. And this is precisely why we cover these developments every day. So share this with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening in the global economy right now. Mark Carney reached the podium in Ottawa at 11:47 in the morning, 2 hours and 45 minutes after the executive order was signed, 15 minutes ahead of Canada's own 4-hour target. Most American media expected what smaller trading partners typically deliver in these moments: a formal objection, a mention of existing agreements, an initial counter tariff on some narrow slice of American products, carefully chosen to signal displeasure without provoking escalation. What Carney announced was none of that. The first element was an immediate and total halt to Canadian uranium exports to the United States. Canada is the world's second largest uranium producer. The United States draws approximately 28% of its nuclear fuel from Canadian sources, fuel that powers 93 American nuclear reactors and supplies electricity to roughly 28 million American homes. The suspension took effect immediately under the 48-hour notice period required by current bilateral agreements. That 48-hour clock had begun before Carney reached the podium. His team had filed the suspension notice at 10:53 in the morning, while the Secretary of Commerce was still finishing his third television interview. The second element was what Canada called internally the Critical Minerals Reorientation Protocol. Under this framework, export licenses for 14 categories of critical minerals would be shifted immediately away from American buyers and redirected toward pre-cleared purchasers in the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The minerals involved included cobalt, of which Canada supplies 38% of American industrial demand, and indium, a key element in roughly 60% of American flat panel display manufacturing. This was not a tariff. It was not a threat. It was a physical rerouting of supply chains, executed through export licensing adjustments that gained legal force the instant Carney stopped speaking. The third element was the disclosure that sent the sharpest jolt through the Situation Room. Canada revealed that morning binding contracts had been signed before 9 o'clock with 7 European nations and 3 Pacific countries, locking in Canadian agricultural exports under new long-term supply deals at fixed prices. Signed. Before 9. Before Trump put pen to paper. The 90-day renegotiation demand written into Section 7 of the executive order, the demand that Canada come back to Washington and beg for access to American agricultural markets, had been made effectively irrelevant before the ink on the order had dried. The customers Trump expected Canada to desperately need had already been replaced. Not threatened with replacement, not suggested for replacement, actually replaced, in writing, with signatures, before 9 a.m. on the same morning the executive order was signed. That detail, the pre-signed agricultural contracts, is the part of this story that has never been fully covered, and whose consequences have not been fully absorbed inside Washington. Canada did not sign those contracts because Trump signed his order. Canada signed those contracts in anticipation of it, which means that somewhere in Ottawa, in the weeks and months before that morning, Canadian trade officials had treated the arrival of this executive order not as a threat to manage, but as a deadline to exploit. A forcing function that gave Canada legitimate grounds to tell third-party agricultural partners that an American trade rupture was imminent, and that partners who acted early would secure better terms than those who waited. The certainty of American pressure had been converted by Canada into a bargaining instrument with every country except America, used to accelerate the construction of a substitute framework before the pressure ever arrived. One European trade analyst, once the full timeline became clear, described it as one of the most disciplined uses of anticipatory economic diplomacy in the post-war era. Canada had spent 18 months quietly, systematically, and almost invisibly making itself less dependent on American markets. One contract, one licensing deal, one bilateral arrangement at a time. By 9:02 in the morning, the dependency that Washington's entire strategy relied upon had already been structurally reduced. The door Trump signed was a door Canada had already moved around. The Wire report reached the Situation Room at approximately 11:52 in the morning. According to 3 officials familiar with what happened in the building that day, the initial reaction was not panic, it was confusion. Senior staff reviewed the uranium suspension first, and immediately asked the legal team whether Canada even had the right to carry out such an action under existing bilateral agreements. The answer came back within 19 minutes. Yes, and the right had been granted, accidentally, by the executive order itself. The order had suspended the Joint Energy Framework. That framework was the primary legal instrument that would have constrained Canadian export redirection of strategic materials. By suspending it, the White House had removed the main legal barrier standing between Canada and the full implementation of the Critical Minerals Reorientation Protocol. The executive order had given Canada the legal tool it needed to execute the response completely. A senior official described the atmosphere in the room once that legal answer came back as the most uncomfortable shift in tone he had witnessed in government. The administration had spent 18 months building pressure. Canada had spent those same 18 months using that pressure to build a reply. And on the morning the pressure was supposed to reach its decisive peak, the executive order had cleared the final legal obstacle in Canada's way. By 1:30 in the afternoon, economic impact forecasts were on the screens. The uranium suspension alone was projected to cost American energy producers between $4.2 and $6.8 billion in the first year, with a 14-month lag before alternative supply chains could be fully assembled. The Critical Minerals Reorientation was projected to disrupt American manufacturing in solar, display technology, and defense electronics, with a first-year effect estimated at $11.3 billion. The agricultural contracts meant the 90-day renegotiation clock was now running against a Canadian government that had, that same morning, reduced its reliance on American agricultural markets by approximately 34%. By 2 in the afternoon, Canada's response, assembled in under 3 hours, was already forecast to cost American interests more in year one than Trump's tariffs were projected to generate in revenue over the same period. The administration had not broken Canada. It had activated Canada's plan, and the plan was working. When Carney spoke at 11:47, he was calm in a way that, in retrospect, communicates everything about the nature of what Canada had prepared. He did not raise his voice. He showed no visible anger. He did not reach for the kind of rhetorical heightening that a leader caught off guard and improvising tends to fall back on. He spoke the way a person speaks when they are working through a plan they trust completely, because they are. After laying out the 3 countermeasures, he paused, looked directly into the cameras, and said 14 words. Canada has been preparing for this morning for some time. We are ready to continue. We are also ready to stop. The decision about which of those 2 things happens next belongs to Washington, not Ottawa. Those 14 words reverse the power dynamic of the entire morning. Trump's executive order had been constructed to push Canada into submission, to force Ottawa into the posture of a smaller country coming to a larger one seeking relief. Carney's reply had transferred the decision of what happened next to Washington, not as a concession, but as a burden. If this continued, it would continue because Washington chose to keep it going. The cost of that choice would fall on American consumers, American manufacturers, and American energy users. Carney then left the podium. The press conference had lasted 11 minutes. The 22-page terms framework the Commerce Department had prepared, the document sitting on the Secretary's desk, ready to be sent to Ottawa once Canada came to the table asking what America needed to lift the tariffs, was never sent. Ottawa never asked. The White House had forecast a 72-hour compliance window. The calculation rested on a portrait of Canadian vulnerability that 18 months of quiet, unseen preparation had made obsolete. Washington had been building strategy around a Canada that no longer existed. 72 hours after the order was signed, uranium suspension had moved from announcement to operation. American nuclear plant operators had formally notified the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that alternative sourcing schedules were being initiated. The critical minerals reorientation had completed its first round of export license transfers. 3 of the 7 new European agricultural agreements had generated their first physical deliveries. The Canadian dollar, which the White House had forecast would fall 4 to 6% in the 72-hour window, had dropped 1.1% before stabilizing as global markets absorbed the scope and credibility of Canada's response. The 22-page document had not left the building. Trade war day zero matters not because of the tariffs, and not even because of the timeline, as striking as that timeline is. It matters because of what it revealed about the foundational assumption underlying the entire American approach. The assumption was that an imbalance of scale is the same as an imbalance of power. A nation with 28 trillion in GDP facing a nation with 2.1 trillion, a superpower and a smaller neighbor. The logic built into every escalation, every deadline, every executive order was that Canada could not afford to resist because the cost of resistance would be too great, and that once Canada understood this, compliance would arrive. What that morning showed is that an imbalance of scale is not an imbalance of preparation. A smaller country that has spent 18 months building alternatives, rerouting supply chains, signing contracts, and constructing contingency architecture can impose outsized costs on a larger country that spent those same 18 months assuming its size made preparation unnecessary. Canada did not match American power. Canada made American power expensive. And in the history of economic confrontation between unequal nations, making power expensive is one of the few approaches that consistently works. The 22-page document is still on the desk. The uranium clock is still running. The mineral licenses are still redirected. The agricultural contracts are still active. Carney is still in Ottawa. And the morning that was designed to end with Canadian compliance has become the case study now examined in trade ministries from Brussels to Tokyo. The reference example of how a prepared nation converts a superpower's pressure into leverage. We track every development in this story every single day. And if this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually unfolding, drop a comment below. Tell us what you think Washington's next move will be, and whether Canada holds its position or the pressure shifts. If you found this valuable, share it with one person who's trying to make sense of what's happening in global trade right now. And if you want this level of analysis delivered to you daily before it reaches mainstream coverage, subscribe. We'll be here every day.